Hi, and welcome to Artalap, South Asia's first independent visual culture podcast with me, Kamayani. Today we have with us a professor of visual culture at University College London, Aparna Kumar, whose work focuses on the making of the Lahore Museum during and after the partition of the subcontinent. Her project details the way in which a shared civilisational heritage was violently split, saved, and fought over during the largest mass migration in recorded history, one of the most traumatic events in the modern period. Dr. Kumar's dissertation, Partition and the Historiography of Art in South Asia, was awarded the inaugural UC Berkeley South Asia Art and Architecture Dissertation Prize in 2021. In her own words, this dissertation argues that the fate of the Lahore collections in the 20th century, situated in both India and Pakistan, but determined by a logic of dislocation and displacement, dramatizes the partition's empirical and epistemological ramifications for art, art institutions, and art writing across South Asia, both then and now. Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. Hi, Aparna. Thank you so much for joining us on Artalab.
Thank you so much, Kamayani, for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here and to have this opportunity to discuss the project with you and your listeners.
Before I contacted you, I visited earlier this year the National Museum here in Delhi because everything was opening up after the worst of the pandemic had passed, and I spent a lot of time at the Harappa section, and that's actually a part of the museum that I love. I found myself spending a lot of time with the dancing girl, and then, she's called the dancing girl. We don't actually know what she was, but yeah, with the figurine of the woman, standing, and I thought about the priest king, who is the other sort of main character from that period that we know about. And then I thought, oh no, actually he's across the border, and it was very funny. I just became very aware of the sort of consequences in some ways of these divisions, and that's why I decided to start Googling like mad, and I came across your work, and I'm very happy that I did, because your dissertation is so rich and it's packed with information. So tell us a little bit about your academic journey as an art historian, from being an undergraduate at Brown to finishing your award-winning doctoral dissertation at UCLA. I'm also curious to know if, being part South Asian factored into your decision to study the region, and if so, how?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting to hear kind of your reflections on the dancing girl and the priest king. And I'm sure we'll come back to those two objects in the course of our conversation, because they were also really formative objects that I've thought with as I developed this project. But a little bit about me, it's interesting because I didn't always want to be an art historian. I came to it quite late in my undergraduate journey. I actually entered undergrad at Brown University as an international relations major. I grew up in a biracial and bicultural household. My dad is an Indian immigrant. He immigrated to the United States in the 70s. My mom is white American. She grew up and was raised in the United States. And so I've always kind of spent my childhood traveling between India and the US, where my families are kind of, the geography of where my family is spread across. And I think as a result of that very unique upbringing in the United States and the just amount of time that I spent in India as a kid, I became really interested at a really young age in issues of diplomacy and international law, but specifically within this context, right, of this kind of US-India or US-South Asia kind of connection. And so that was always something that I was really drawn to. When I started at Brown, I began to kind of, curate my studies in that vein. I began to study Hindi and Urdu really extensively. I took a selection of courses on South Asian history and politics. The year that I started was also, I think, one of the first years that Professor Vazira Zaminder joined Brown University's faculty. Of course, her book on the long partition and the making of modern South Asia, I think retroactively, I'm realizing how important and how formative it was for me to kind of encounter her teaching and her work at that early stage. But at that beginning, I had every intention of going to law school or going to business school. Art history was still very much a kind of elective for me. Things really began to change in my second and third years. This was kind of a moment when I started to really think more deeply about, I was really drawn to Hindi and Urdu. I was spending a lot of time learning these languages, one, to be able to speak with my family in India, but also, I was drawn more and more into the kind of aesthetic and political dimensions of what it means to study and speak these languages. And this was also a time in my education where we had a visiting professor at Brown, and she was the first person to offer classes on South Asian art and architecture in the course of my education. And this was actually Dr. Malika Kumbra Landres, who is actually now a colleague of mine at Oxford. And she offered this course on Islamic art and architecture on the Indian subcontinent. It was a course that I think took us from the early Sultanate period through the Mughal Empire. It introduced us to kind of monumental architectural forms, things that I was familiar with, right? Like the Taj Mahal or the Jama Masjid in Delhi or the Red Fort in Delhi, things that I had seen in the course of my childhood, travels, but things that I hadn't really thought deeply about. And it really opened kind of new worlds for me, this course, and the ways that it started to kind of bridge my interest in Urdu, bridge my studies on South Asian politics, on histories of empire and colonialism that I was, very much immersed in my kind of in my studies of international relations and political science. And things kind of snowballed from there. I think, that class for me, I look back on it, it was my first introduction to the field of South Asian art history. I didn't know that a field like that could exist, that it was possible to study something like that. And I saw great possibility in the field. It was a way, there was a way in which I could bring everything that I was interested in into one subject, whether it was art, culture, politics, reflections on my own heritage, my interest in language and writing. And yeah, I think from there, things kind of snowballed, and I became really interested in what I could do with this field of South Asian art history. And I think my mentors at the time, they pushed me towards UCLA, and I was very fortunate to kind of land there. When I applied to graduate school, there were not that many people who were, teaching modern and contemporary South Asian art. There were not that many programs where I could pursue the project that ultimately became my dissertation. This since has changed, but that's, at the time back in 2010, there were very few. And I ended up working in a department at UCLA that had not one, but two specialists of South Asian art history. My advisor, Professor Saloni Mathur, who works on modern and contemporary, and my committee member, Professor Robert Brown, who works on the earlier period. So there's I think, to come back to your original question, I think my being South Asian certainly shaped my decision to pursue art history, but it was one of many reasons. And I think it was a very kind of layered journey that brought me from, Brown to UCLA to this point now.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to sort of think about how we arrive at a particular subject of study, especially when you're going to devote so many years of your life to it. You have to be really passionate about it. And I find it exciting also to hear about the many different people and courses and maybe even, scholarly works or art objects that might have prompted different kinds of movements within that trajectory. So I guess I'm also curious to know, from what you've said. So, like I totally understand you having cultivated this interest in South Asian visual culture and material culture. But why did you decide to focus on the period of the partition specifically and also delve into the Lahore Museum in such detail?
Yeah, I think I really came to this project of, the question of partition and the question of the Lahore Museum through the contemporary period. which has been marked by a resurgence of interest in partition history in many different directions. We see artists and curators working in South Asia, working in the South Asian diaspora, who are turning to this moment of 1947 in their work as a means to kind of address contemporary social, political, and economic unrest. And this is a turn that has been prompted by several different kinds of, I think, transformations and public discussions around the 50th and 75th anniversaries of Indian and Pakistani independence. I think the events, the kind of communal unrest around the events at Ayodhya, around the Gujarat riots of 2002, kind of military conflict between India and Pakistan, the kind of current violence that's happening in regions of Jammu and Kashmir. I was really drawn, I think, to the contemporary period and kind of these discussions by my work on the contemporary South Asian artist Zarina Hashmi. I wrote my MA thesis on one of Zarina's what I believe to be her most iconic works of art. Zarina is a printmaker. She worked primarily on paper, and she often brings in the course of her works, brings this kind of minimalist, abstract language into dialogue with Urdu words, with poetry, with kind of her reflections on her homeland, on her movement and travels across the world, on questions of, I think her kind of own relationship to her experience of partition, having lived through it as a child. And I started working on this one print of hers called Dividing Line, which is an abstracted rendering of the Indo-Pakistani border in Punjab. You look at the work, it's this really kind of austere meditation on this border that is both real and imagined in many respects. It's kind of abstracted from, I mean, the line itself is already an abstraction when you think about what a map represents, but it's even further distanced, I think, from its kind of cartographic bearings. And you're left with this incredible line across a piece of paper that is at once a border, it's a scar, it's a wound, it's an extremely powerful and violent image. And I found myself really drawn into this work and what it could mean for how we think about partition history, how we write partition history. And through this project, I started to notice kind of broader trends within the historiography of art in South Asia. There's a tension really in how partition was described and dealt with in kind of wider histories of art and architecture across the region. I think major surveys of modern art, for example, often stopped at 1947 or started at 1947, circumventing, right, the partition as a beginning or an end point. Others adopted nationalist frameworks that, saw the kind of partition either removed from the story or naturalized, right, as part of this kind of moment of nationalization in the 1940s, right? So, and this was really, I noticed this, and it was really in tension with kind of swelling public discourse around partition history in the present, in the contemporary moment, where we were seeing oral histories and archival projects bring a different kind of perspective on how partition should be discussed and memorialized, right, as this kind of collective trauma, as something that was an extremely violent and ongoing process of division. And so I was really interested in thinking about, right, these historical tensions and its urgency, right, for the present moment. And my interest in the Lahore Museum is part my own interest. I've always been very interested in kind of histories or tools of soft and cultural diplomacy. So, the museum, I think, is partly tied to my training in political science. I'm very interested in how the museum has operated in diplomatic context. So I was always really drawn to it. But it was also, I came across the story of the Lahore Museum in conversation with my supervisor,
Yeah, Saloni Mathur, just so our audience knows whom.
who is an expert in museum studies and who was already kind of thinking about, the history and politics of display and exhibition history. And I encountered the initial story, I think, in one of her classes. And it kind of, built from there. It was something that really grabbed my attention. And I thought, had a lot of possibility for me to bring all of my interests together into a single project. And I would say, I think lastly, I can really only say this retrospectively after completing the dissertation, that a part of me was drawn to this period for personal reasons as well. I think, as someone who is, biracial Indian American woman who's growing up in the diaspora, who has a very different kind of relationship to this history, I think I became very interested in understanding how the partition affected my life, right? Affected my life and the ways in which I can belong to my heritage, the ways in which I can belong and inhabit these categories of identity, like South Asian, like Indian, like Hindu, like, these varying kind of categories that are concretized and solidified through this history of division. So it did become a very kind of personal project as well, kind of thinking through my own kind of narratives of belonging as well.
Yeah, I think that comes through in the work as well. It's certainly injected with this kind of intimacy. I think that also comes from having maybe grown up with a certain imagination about a homeland. And also, I think Zarina's work indeed has been a source of salvation at one level for a lot of people trying to reckon with that repressed memory or that trauma. To respond to your point about the contemporaneity of Zarina's work as well, 2 years ago, there was a show here, sort of retrospective of her work at the KNMA in Delhi, Life in 9 Lines. And at the time, the anti CAA protests were raging in India because she worked so much with paper. It just struck me as a citizen as much as a spectator that these technologies of trauma and the specter of the partition really is something that you live with. You have protests, you have a pogrom happening on the basis of paper, which is a bureaucratic material, right, as well.
Yeah.
And then to kind of see Zarina's work, which, as you talked about so eloquently, is so impactful and powerful. And, she works so much with paper and its possibilities as a material. Since we're talking about trauma and we're talking about memory, I think that the museum is yet another site on which this larger socio-political and historical flux was playing out. It became yet another locus of contestation and anxiety and controversy, antagonism, let's say. And it continues to be. I think the most alluring aspect of the dissertation, in many ways, it was all the stories of how specific objects and works migrated and the battles that were fought, by councils, by administrative bodies. It was sort of like a seemingly less bloody history of the partition. I think it's important to talk about how this material traffic point to those feelings of dispossession and dislocation.
Absolutely. I think this project really asks what the visual arts can uniquely contribute to our understanding of partition history, right? In fact, I think one of my main arguments of the thesis is really that the material archive itself, in all of its forms, is an important vantage point from which to write and see this history, from which to understand the partition's ramifications for art and society in South Asia. So, an important question for me as I was going through this project was to think about, what does it mean to inhabit this vantage point of the material archive? And for me, it was not enough to discuss what the archive contained, but how it moved, where it moved, why it moved, who moved it, who was moving around it, right? And how these histories of movement are entangled, right, with these kind of broader histories of transformation that also characterize the period of partition. So this approach brought the history of the Lahore Museum alive for me in a very different kind of way, right? I found myself thinking about this institution not simply in terms of its architecture or its curatorial narratives, but through the mobility of its objects, the objects that would be collected within the institution, that would be displayed there, that was conserved there, but also eventually sent away from there, right? How these histories of travel and movement can also be an extension of this institution that we see, stagnated, that we would otherwise see as stagnated in place. And so, in part of what the dissertation is really trying to think about is this kind of how do we, capture this history of movement, the way that the institution moves. And so, part of my early kind of parts of the dissertation is tracing the Lahore Museum's movement from Wazir Khan's Bardari in Lahore to Old Tollington Market to the kind of new Jubilee building where it is and stands currently. But then also thinking about, okay, well, once its collections were divided, where did India's share of the collections go, right? Tracing its journey from Amritsar to Shimla to Patiala to Chandigarh to within Chandigarh. It moved several times once it arrived in the city of Chandigarh. But then also the stories of individual objects themselves was also really important for how I told and expanded the history of the Lahore Museum. And I open the dissertation with the famous case of the priest king and the Mohenjo-daro dancing girl. And so that the fact that you kind of arrived to my project through these objects, through your experience of the protohistoric galleries in the National Museum is really important, I think, and it really speaks right to the power of these objects and their mobility across the 20th century. These were archaeological relics that were discovered at Indus civilization site of Mohenjo-daro in the early 20th century. The Priest King is a terracotta sculpture, which we have, I think, a little bit more kind of terracotta sculpture from these sites than we do metal sculpture, which is, the Mohenjo-daro dancing girl is kind of emblematic of that as a bronze piece. These were rare relics, right, that were found from Mohenjo-daro that have since, I think, in the years since 1947 in particular, become symbols of India and Pakistan as quote unquote rival nation states. The priest king is in the collections of the National Museum of Karachi. The Mohenjo-daro dancing girl is of course, and as you said, in the collections of the National Museum of India in Delhi. And yet, right, the irony is that they are from a shared cultural site, right? They're from a shared civilization. And so here you can already, the priest king and the dancing girl are amazing to kind of really think with and personify, I think, the burden and pressure, both ideological and physical, that objects of art and heritage have been forced to bear in the years since the partition, as India and Pakistan and Bangladesh have come into their own as nation states, right? And you can really see those kinds of pressures.
Can you tell us what the travel itinerary of the priest king and the dancing girl might have been?
I really became fascinated with the priest king and the dancing girl because their movements are not as easy as we would think. Their arrival into these institutions was not seamless. It involved, I think, initially kind of figuring out how these objects arrived in these museums, involved sifting through a lot of rumor and a lot of hearsay. There was a rumor that the priest king came to Pakistan in the 1970s after being a part of India's national collections. As the story goes, that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto negotiated the return of the priest king in conversation with Indira Gandhi as part of the Shimla Agreement of 1972. Now, this is unsubstantiated rumor, but it was rumor that I encountered over and over and over again as I was kind of tracing the movements of these objects. So it clearly is a very powerful story. But this story, again, it's unsubstantiated. And actually, the arrival of these objects in these national museums is a much more convoluted story. The priest king and the dancing girl were part of the kind of contested archaeological collections that was divided in 1949 between India and Pakistan as part of the larger division process of the partition. The priest king was actually as far as my records show now, was actually in London at the time of the partition. It had been sent likely as early as 1931 to be part of the Burlington Fine Arts exhibition on Indian art. And it stayed, I think, in London. As far as my records show now, it stayed in London to be part of the Royal Academy of Arts show on the Indian and Pakistani art in 1947 as well. While the dancing girl actually was moved, I think, more domestically. We see kind of, it was discovered at Mohenjo-daro, part of the kind of collections of the Site Museum that was established at Mohenjo-daro, but it was moved to Delhi in 1946 to be part of exhibitions that were happening in Delhi at that time. And so what's interesting is that the fate of these collections was determined kind of in consort with the fate of the collections of the Lahore Museum in the 1940s. So the priest king was given to Pakistan as part of these kinds of larger negotiations, and the dancing girl remained with India. Even though I think to this day, both Pakistan and India claim ownership of these objects in kind of varying different ways. And this case study was really important for me because I think you get a sense of just how expansive the geopolitics of the division process was, right? Even though the dissertation focuses on the story of the Lahore Museum, you really get a sense in which the division of the Lahore Museum's collections did not just happen in Lahore. It was happening in Lahore. It was happening in Delhi. It was happening in London. It was happening, in a variety of different spaces, right? And so, what happens when we think about partition in this kind of broader geographic landscape? The other thing that I love about the Priest King and Dancing Girl is it helps us really think about the ongoing nature of the division process, right? This is not something that stopped in 1947, 48, and 49 when the Lahore Museum's collections were divided. This is a division process that is ongoing and manifests in moments of great political tension, right? I think that's one of the reasons why we have this really powerful rumor about the Priest King in 1972. But I think, in other moments of political tension, we'll see this discourse around the repatriation of these objects, the Priest King and the Mohenjo-daro dancing girl, rise in public discourse. There were several repatriation campaigns for the Mohenjo-daro dancing girl back to Pakistan, I think in 2016 and 2017. So there's, again, it's about forcing us to really kind of reorient our thinking around the partition as an ongoing process of division.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I think the fact that, like you said, the rumor around the priest king, the fact that it persisted, 30 years after the partition had officially happened, and you would think that things were somewhat settled. I think that's very telling, like you said. And there is definitely a sort of romance associated with these objects. They become part of a narrative that has more to do with the political and ideological currents in both these countries than the objects themselves, right? Also, I think we should just like petition to rename the dancing girl. That pose is like an administrator's pose. That pose is not a lady looking to, get down. You know what I mean? That's not what that is. Because when I went earlier this year, I was just struck by how powerful she is as well. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I think that yeah, for sure, these two pieces, two of the most famous pieces on either side of the border, and I think, segueing from that, I'd like to just also talk a little bit about, the language that is often used to discuss these objects, which is so similar to the language that is used for people, right? Like you've touched upon the fact that criminality, for instance, as a category, or homelessness, these were both categories of description for objects moving between Lahore and its sort of de facto Indian counterpart, the Chandigarh Museum. And I find this fascinating because, as is evident from the usage of these descriptors, these adjectives, the trauma of displacement that we were talking about and that we know about with regard to people was in some ways projected onto these inanimate objects and these artworks and these items of material heritage. So I find that really fascinating. And also just the fact that, for instance, we've been talking about the priest king and the boss girl as if they're real people, right? because there's something
Yeah.
about them that is sort of that almost individualizes and anthropomorphizes them in the broader kind of imagination.
Yeah, I think that the language used to describe India's share of the Lahore Museum's collections was among the most fascinating discoveries of my project. So, kind of just to reiterate, I think the collections, and this is really talking about the share of the Lahore Museum's collections that were transferred to India in 1949 and became part of the base collections of the Chandigarh Museum by 1968. These objects, they were described in a variety of different ways by the museum officials, scholars, and administrators that were charged with caring for these objects between 1949 and 1968 when it becomes acquired by the Chandigarh Museum. And, this language varies. It varies, it's often talked about in terms of fugitive, right? So the fugitive collections lurking about in India as they kind of find their way to the Chandigarh Museum. Or another term that was often used was homelessness, in search of a home. These were collections. Again, that I think, if we look at the kind of longer history of movement of these collections between 1949, before they're acquired by the Chandigarh Museum, they were wandering between institutions, between museums, between state archives before they were kind of solidified as this base collection for the Chandigarh Museum. So there's a way in which, this language was so descriptive and so powerful, particularly, as you said, for the ways in which it relates to the larger kind of crises that also characterize this period. I think that this language really forces us to grapple with partition's ramifications for heritage and museums in deep relationship to the larger humanitarian crisis that was also the partition, right? Partition involved an unprecedented transfer of populations, and upwards of 20 million people being displaced across the Indian subcontinent as a result of this decision to partition the Indian subcontinent in Punjab and Bengal, right? And these numbers are very much in dialogue with the numbers that we see, that characterize other kind of global catastrophes of the 20th century, including World War One, World War Two, the Nazi Holocaust of World War Two. So this is to say that it's important, I think, this language of fugitive, of homelessness, I think really reinforces the entanglement, right, of the cultural crises of partition with the movement of people, with this kind of disruption of these communities, of these populations. And one of the things that, I really started to kind of think about where this language was coming from, becomes a really important part of the kind of later half of the dissertation. And I think it's really indicative of the people who were charged with caring for these collections. These were administrators like MS Randhawa, who was a Indian civil servant working in various different sectors of the Indian government post-partition, primarily in contexts where he's working with refugee populations, right, and relocating these populations that are coming in from what is then, the state of Pakistan into India, and finding homes, resettling them in various communities. And he becomes very interested in also caring for the urban fabric of the cities in which he's working with, part of which entails thinking about the care and conservation of the city's heritage. And so I think it's no coincidence, right, that he gravitates toward this language of homelessness, or this language of criminality or fugitive, because it overlaps with the language of kind of the refugee resettlement projects that are happening in this period. This language is also, I think, really indicative of certain kinds of anxieties, I think, around cultural material in this period, and a kind of recognition, if implicit, about the power of art and culture to incite certain forms of conflict. There is a sense in which art and culture, like people, need to be settled with the nation state, right? So there's a sense in which cultural patrimony or national culture is something that is created and settled. This language of criminality and homelessness really points to the ways in which art and culture, at least implicitly, was viewed as a potential threat to the post-colonial nation state in its moment of arrival and infancy. And so the kinds of the kinds of strategies that needed to be developed to settle art and culture in certain ways so that it bolstered, right, the infrastructure of the post-colonial nation state in its moment of arrival. And I think that so if anything, this language really gave me an opportunity to think about, again, the entanglements of these kind of cultural and humanitarian crises of partition, but also, right, the difficult conditions in which national patrimony is actually made.
It's such a complex and riveting analysis at one level because there's so much involved. And like for instance, I mean, one way to do it is in the way that you've done it, which is to pick an institution and extract a certain kind of story. You note this in your dissertation as well, which is that the partition is such a strange kind of moment because it's sort of simultaneously a moment of decimation and rebuilding. So you have to forget that you share a history and
Yes.
you have to invent a new legacy. And a lot of these maneuvers, whether it's in the form of policy or institution building or sort of administrative facilitation of movement of these objects, which is what a lot of the public servants, civil servants, both English and Indian and Pakistani were doing, speaks to that, right? To that, as you talked about. One thing I'm also interested in is just that also, like, bits of, I mean, as thrilling as the journey of some of these objects is, I mean, there are all of these administrative, bureaucratic aspects, right, of museum building. And you talk about this in one of the chapters where you unpack how the machinery of the partition enters the museum in full force. Because there are these kind of power struggles happening between administrators, curators, civil servants, ordinary citizens. And there are squabbles between provincial and centralized departments, and imperial infrastructure being split into two new jurisdictions, further entailing more subdivisions, all of them often at odds with each other. And all of this is happening within a very short period of time. We know that this was a colonial hack job, the way that India and Pakistan and Bangladesh were created. So I just find that I found that also very fascinating. Like, there are all of these policies and statutes and sort of legal tussles that are happening. I was wondering if you could shed some light on the drama rama.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the administrative complexities of the division process was one of the most difficult aspects of the project to kind of one figure out, but then also narrate in a way that, as you said, really captures the drama, but also the tensions, right? And between these kinds of hierarchies of nation, region, province, of colonial state, national state, post-colonial state. There's just it was so many layers to kind of piece out, but then also to kind of narrate how they come together, how they are in tension with one another constantly through this dissertation or through this division process. And for me, it was really important to kind of understand how the division of the Lahore Museum's collections fit into the wider conditions of the division process. It was really important for me to understand how its administrative infrastructure overlapped with this machinery, right, of the partition council, the extraordinary bureaucracy that, as you said, is created in a very short amount of time to implement, right, the division process on a very pragmatic and practical level. And this is where I think I really tried to kind of think about the Lahore Museum's experience, or think through the Lahore Museum's experience through the division of land that was happening there, the division of people, through the division of other types of heritage, including monuments that characterized this period. And this is, it really helped me, I think, in situating the Lahore Museum's experience against this kind of these broader conditions, really helped me kind of piece apart the very intricate layers of political and cultural jurisdiction that characterized the institution from within as well. So, I mean, museums were kind of hubs of imperial administration. And so I quickly discovered that parts of the museum's collections were treated very differently at partition than other parts. And this has a lot to do with the ways in which the Lahore Museum's collections were constituted beginning in the 1800s and then reorganized again in the 1940s, right before the partition. It was home to a collection that had a provincial orientation, one that was meant to really personify and reflect the region of Punjab, of undivided Punjab. And this kind of provincial collection, which included its painting collection, its textile collections, its decorative arts collections, its sculpture collections, they belonged administratively to the province of undivided Punjab. But in the 1940s, the Lahore Museum, courtesy of the Archaeological Survey of India and leaders like Mortimer Wheeler, the Lahore Museum also had become hubs of other imperial collections, mainly archaeological collections that were coming in from sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, become a storehouse of many of the region's Indus civilization relics. And actually, Mortimer Wheeler had at one point designed or kind of conceived a plan to transform the Lahore Museum into an Indus civilization museum. And right there, I mean, already in that kind of conception, you get to see the identity of the museum and its collections in flux, right? There's a way in which it's provincially oriented, it's regionally oriented, and it has national aspirations as well. And all of these kinds of jurisdictions come into play when the collections are then divided, right? Because the provincial collections have their own kind of decision and arrangement, an own set of actors that are in charge with the division of its collections. The archaeological collections that belong to the imperial government has its own arrangement. It's decided in conversation with the central partition council with administrators of the Archaeological Survey of India, and so it has its own kind of decision. And so it's a very, very difficult, I think, piecing out those kind of administrative layers. Administrative jurisdictions is, I think, a word that I use often in the dissertation, was really, really, really key, I think, in explicating the complexity of this process, but also in explicating just the difficulty, right? In the pragmatic difficulties that many of the human actors, right, who are making this division process possible, had to face. And I think one of the things that was really helpful for me in starting to visualize a lot of this complexity was the work of Anwasha Sen Gupta, who has done incredible work on kind of visualizing this machinery of partition, and has kind of helped me see at least the ways in which the partition council was operating, the arbitral tribunal was operating, the provincial partition councils were operating, as well as their liaising committees, and how they kind of all come together at the hands of museum staff, at the hands of archaeological staff, to really affect the division of these collections. And so, yes, it was a very difficult story to navigate.
You talked about Anvesha Sengupta's work, and I was going to ask you to maybe delve a little bit into the methodological and maybe more discursive aspects of the dissertation. The work literally sort of straddles the borders, obviously, of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and challenges the dominant art historiographical method in South Asia, which is that of the nation state. So, do you want to talk about the departure from that? I mean, your work is sort of, is part of the movement away from that sort of analysis, and also about the importance of the regional, maybe, as an analytic to study modern and contemporary visual and material culture in South Asia.
Absolutely. I think For me, the project was really about thinking against the national and the kind of systemic erasures that national frameworks produced within the historiography of South Asian art. And for our understanding of partition and its impact on art and society in South Asia. And the regional became a very important framework for this project. I think the regional intention, right, with the national. I think I'm not working with these frameworks in isolation. And I think for me, it was really important to kind of show in the way that I, narrated the history and establishment of the Lahore Museum, or in the kinds of people and subjectivities that I focused on, how these institutions and peoples navigated these multiple levels and really brought the province, brought the region, brought the nation and the colonial state all into tension, animated those tensions. It's an institution that's established as a colonial institution, but it's something that, at the hands of a figure like John Lockwood Kipling, that embraces a much more wider provincial kind of orientation that is operating right as a regional institution intimately intertwined with representing the region of Punjab, but at the same time has global aspirations of supporting right the project of empire as well. But then, this kind of provincial orientation also feeds and intersects with the institution's kind of national ambitions as well by the 20th century. The ways in which it's, relating to the kind of, the ancient archaeological sites of the Indus civilization and the kind of possibilities that these archaeological discoveries have for the kinds of histories that the region can tell about itself, right? Both for a national project, but also for a post colonial project. And I think that, for me, right, it really is about kind of thinking about the interrelationships and the entanglements of these frameworks. And so I was really interested in what it would mean for our art history to work with and write with the tensions of those frameworks.
While we're talking about the span of the regional, I was also put in mind of like just the fact that, what we were talking about right at the beginning, that so many Indians, I mean, can't really access the Lahore Museum, and so many Pakistani scholars can't access the Delhi Museum, etc. And so I think one of the issues that historians from or people who work with the scholars who work with archives from South Asia have is that we can't access each other's collections. So I was wondering, like, do you want to talk about how you position yourself as a scholar? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of building on our previous discussion about kind of the relationship between the national and the regional, I think in bringing these kind of frameworks or kind of elucidating the tensions between these frameworks and how I was narrating the story of the Lahore Museum, one of the things that became very clear to me, right, is the fractures and artificiality of the border. This problematic of the border became very, very important for me in terms of how I situated myself with respect to my archives, with respect to the story of the Lahore Museum. One of the things that I realized very early on is the border is not something that just divides nation states and populations, right? It is something that regulates access to archives, museums, to knowledge, right? It determines in many ways what we know and how we know it. I did face some difficulties in getting my visa as a person of Indian heritage to research in certain kinds of institutions in Pakistan. But then I'm facing this difficulty as a scholar who is also coming from an enormous position of privilege. Someone who's coming from an American institution, who's traveling on an American passport, who's has the financial support to spend 2 years traveling and researching for this project, right? These forms of bureaucracy that regulate this border are also impacting the ability of scholars in South Asia to be able to produce these histories. they are facing even more difficulty, even more hurdles to the kinds of access to these institutions. And this is something that when we're thinking about like the place of partition history in the history of South Asian art, when we're thinking about it through the lens of through the border, you can see it. It's not an absence. It's not a gap. It's actually a product of a kind of systemic barrier to access, right? You can't produce cross-border histories if you can't move across the border, right? If you can't get access to these institutions. So I think experiencing that on a very physical level and being in conversation with communities on both sides of the border was really, really important for me in illuminating those just practical difficulties in how we write history and how we know what we know. This project was only made possible through a huge amount of collaboration. And I think, if anything, it urgently advocates for more kinds of like a more conscious kind of a collaborative history writing, if that makes sense. And I think there are two scholars that I really turned to, I think, when I was thinking about the kind of form I wanted my dissertation to take, in terms of its narrative, in terms of its kind of methodological kind of ambitions. And for me, I turned to one scholar that I really turned to was Amir Mufti, and his idea of partition as method. And this was very important for me. This is coming out of, kind of context of comparative literature. And it's an idea, the idea of partition as method is one that asserts, partition is not simply a historical event or process of division that occurred in the past, but it's a critical orientation that forces us to kind of think about the partition as the very modality of culture in South Asia. It's a political logic that continues to shape operations, that continues to shape the activities of the state and society, that continues to regulate, right, how people move across this geography, that move and can't move, right, across this geography. And in this view, partition is a condition of division that we continue to inhabit, that in the present, that continues to impact us, right? This is an argument for partition as an unfinished process of division, which is something that, my dissertation really, really tries to argue for. The other kind of method or kind of inspiration that was really important for me was Vizira Zamindar's methodology of writing on the border. And this is coming out of her kind of own, I think, her own travels, her own kind of cross-border experiences of working with communities and archives in both India and Pakistan. And I think it represents a kind of very conscious methodological approach to challenging the separation of these archives, to really entwining them as and treating them not as separate archives, but as archives of a shared kind of history right from the outset, right? So, kind of challenging the physical distance, the ideological distance that is built between these archives, whether they're museums or they're state archives or they're communities, archives in all of its forms. And so I think combining these two ideas for me provided a way to narrate the story of the Lahore Museum in a very interesting way. My most important model for me was, my supervisor. I was very fortunate to work with Professor Saloni Mathur at UCLA. She modeled a very urgent kind of interdisciplinarity for me in her art historical scholarship. I think her training as an anthropologist, I think, probably impacted that, but also kind of her very, powerful relationship to kind of critical theory as well, in the ways in which she kind of brings to her scholarship was really important for me. But I also drew inspiration from scholars, who kind of set the stage for me. There were this brilliant work that's being done in museum studies from Sheila Bhatti's kind of initial history of the Lahore Museum, which was really important ethnography of this institution that really was, I think, illuminated a lot of the kind of initial ruptures and fissures that make up this institution going into the 1940s. Tapati Guhatakurta and Kavita Singh's work on monuments and museums in South Asia, I think, help make a space for a project like mine to come about. In the attention, I think, that they are giving to museums, the ways in which these scholars are talking about the institutions in such textured ways, right, really helped illuminate these institutions as powerful vehicles for social and political transformation. And so I think their work has also been really important for me. And then I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention the work of Nayanjot Lahiri, who's an archaeological historian who I think is one of the first to really think about the division of cultural material in this period. And her work really focuses on the division of archaeological collections and also the impact that partition had specifically on monuments or immovable heritage, right? Objects that couldn't be transferred between India and Pakistan. So I really see my project as a kind of extension or a kind of in conversation, right, with the work that these scholars, did before me.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's sort of the who's who of art history and partition studies, I think. I was actually thinking about this as you were speaking as well. Just to go back to our conversation about Zarina as well, I remember reading Amir Mufti's essay on her work, and he sort of talks about her work as being a kind of as embodying the art of dispossession. And he invokes the figure of the stateless refugee. And that's a figure that continues to be such an important character in regional, local, national, and international histories, even today. I mean, we know this from just living in the contemporary moment as well. And, I think we're talking about all of these people who've contributed so much to our understanding of 20th century and 21st century art in the subcontinent. I think also your dissertation sort of gestures towards that as well. The contemporary as a kind of context in which to revisit so many of these debates. And I think with the partition, and we talked about it earlier, but it's sort of this ever present phantom, right, that haunts both India and Pakistan and their religious nationalist projects because it happened, at least in the public imagination, along religious lines. So, for example, in India, very recently, or there's the Central Vista project is coming up. It's very controversial, and the relocation of the National Museum by India's Hindutva government is a great cause of concern. And there's a lot of anxiety about the preservation and assemblage and presentation, exhibition of the collection in the National Museum. And in fact, Kavita Singh earlier this year, she raised some very important questions about the opacity with which this relocation of the National Museum is happening. And I mean, I'm quoting her, but she basically says that a museum has professional obligations towards three constituencies: objects, knowledge, and people. And then she goes on to argue how this opacity is sort of serving none of those constituencies. So I thought that your work also, like, bringing that into conversation with what's happening currently, both in in the sort of regional and national contexts in India and Pakistan. I thought we could maybe discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the contemporary is a major kind of, I mean, it was my entry point into this project, but it is a major specter of everything that I think I do as an art historian. For me, I'm really interested in, the relevance, right, of partition history for the kinds of our understanding the kinds of politics, political shifts, social transformations that are happening today. And I think, if anything, the Central Vista project cannot be divorced from these histories of museum division, these histories of object mobility that I think are at the very heart of the Lahore Museum's story. It is an extension of these histories. And I think for grounds with great urgency, the ways in which the politics and division processes of the partition are ongoing. And if there's anything that I hope my kind of project brings to this conversation, it is more visibility to the ways in which objects of art and heritage, archives like museums, the kinds of burdens, both physical and ideological, the kinds of violence that these objects and spaces bear, right, as nation states transition in their various kind of political identities, whether it's from colony to post-colony, right, or it's from different kinds of national orientations as well. And it's, I think one of the things that I think really comes through in my project, but also in Kavita's work and in very kind of powerful ways, is that the museum is not a stagnant institution, and it is not an institution that is just kind of there. It is a vehicle for politics and identity. And I think, if anything, I hope my work provides urgency around thinking about the ways in which the museum is being used and appropriated to solidify certain kinds of political agendas. And I think, the movements we're seeing in museums and archives in Delhi are not coincidental. They are indicative of larger ideological projects that are at play that we need to be attentive to, right? They have implications for the types of history a state, a government, political official can write. And in turn, it has really lived ramifications for how people belong, right? To a culture, to a space, to a nation state, to a national identity, right? And if anything, right, that we learn from the Lahore Museum story is that nation building is a violent process, right? It is as much about unity, right, the kind of unification of collections, as it is about the disunity and exclusion, about erasure, right? And that's something that we really kind of see in how, I mean, in the case of the priest king, right, and the dancing girl, to bring it back to that kind of, that really iconic case study, right? The ways in which these objects have been implicated in both the rise of and solidification of national identities, but also the erasures of violence, of trauma, of certain kinds, forms of belonging, right? And so, again, I think, if anything, right, the history of the Lahore Museum is intimately intertwined with what's happening right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think that yes, to sort of come back to the priest king and the girl, it's sort of it's almost like these objects are connected with so much affective power that, and they can be mobilized, and they are mobilized, to incite entire populations, or attract them towards certain political ends. And I also wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the broader sort of international conversation between former colonial governments and ex-colonies regarding repatriation and restitution. And I think that I wanted to talk about that also in the context of like this continued presence of the colonial infrastructure in access to these objects, in writing about these objects. I mean, and you've talked about it in the conversation as well, how the partition is as much a nationalist project as a post-colonial one, and there's always this tension. To me, the priest king is a very interesting example because I was unable to understand if you would really call that a repatriation, right?
Mm,
Like I wasn't sure if it's a repatriation. Like, what is that?
right.
What kind of return is it really? Because it never really left its kind of its civilizational ambit, but we talk about a repatriation in terms of a return to what is now Pakistan.
No, it's a wonderful question. And I think the Lahore Museum is really interesting for me because, yes, I see it very much in dialogue with a lot of these global conversations that are happening around repatriation, around decolonization. But for me, especially on the subject of repatriation, what it helps me think about is the ways in which these discourses around repatriation and decolonization are still rooted in the West and determined by the West. And I think that the case of the, Priest King, or the case of the Lahore Museum's collections, what it shows us is that these museums and these collections they're implicated in processes of colonization, nationalization, and decolonization that have been ongoing for a enormous amount of time. And they're not just spaces where these processes are occurring, but they're actively participating in shaping how these processes, unfold. And one of the things that I'm always really frustrated, I think, with the ways in which repatriation is discussed, I think, in a Euro-American context, right, is it's often dealing with, it's often kind of dealing with institutions, who have kind of Western museums who have taken objects under various kind of contexts of colonialism, war, kind of imperial looting, under very violent contexts, and are repatriating them back, right, to kind of their former colonies. So that there's a very interesting kind of power dynamic that you're dealing with in these kinds of conversations. But I think for me, what I've seen happen is that repatriation in those kinds of contexts is described as a kind of end goal, right? It's described as like, you repatriate this object and you've made up for everything. You've kind of rectified these kind of colonial wrongs, and that is not the case. Repatriation is not an end. If anything, it's a beginning, and we need to be situating and thinking about repatriation as in terms of a much longer process of nationalization, decolonization, colonization. And I think one of the things that the Lahore Museum case study helps us see and helps us think about is the ways in which these institutions have been navigating processes of decolonization in a much longer array, right? Where repatriation is not just about a kind of return, right? But it's actually complicating the very origins, or how we identify the origins of objects to begin with. And so I think that that's a very kind of powerful, I mean, thinking about repatriation coming out of this kind of, the South Asian context is so powerful for kind of, again, complicating what I see is already a kind of Eurocentric bias in terms of how repatriation is discussed and implemented globally. I also think that for me, the case of the Lahore Museum is so important because I think it provides a language or a point of departure into the forms of kind of cultural violence and cultural dispossession that characterizes and continues to characterize the post colonial world in a way that gives us, I think, a kind of direction or a kind of language to start thinking about multiple different contexts, right? So I think there's a way in which we can think about the violence that occurs within the Lahore Museum at Partition in dialogue with other kinds of contexts, whether it's the annihilation of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, or it's the plundering of the old imperial palace in Beijing. It's the kind of these other moments of cultural dispossession in the kind of 18th, 19th, 20th century into the present. And I think for me, it provides a different kind of way to narrate a history of art or a global history of art, one that's really premised in these kinds of comparative frameworks, or these interconnections across territories, across geographies, across cultures. And for me, I think the Lahore Museum is so important because it provides a way for us a way into that kind of form of writing and thinking.
For sure, for sure. And I think that, yeah, and I think it's just that also this feeling that, well, we're still living with the consequences of that, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I still can't go and see the priest king, or like, my counterparts in Pakistan can't come and see
yeah.
the Harappan girl. So, all of that, I think, there's a little bit of angst there, can you tell? But it's been wonderful just kind of learning about the various experiences, strategies, sort of conceptual struggles that led to this dissertation. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for your time, Aparna.
Thank you, Kamayani. No, thank you so much for, initiating the conversation. I've learned a lot being in conversation with you too about your experiences and your response to the project. So I'm really grateful.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in to Artalap with Aparna Kumar as we discussed her award-winning dissertation on the Lahore Museum as a site for understanding the political and art historical dimensions of the South Asian partition and its implications for the study of Indo-Pak heritage. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP.